Across America today, the quiet echo of loss stretches from classrooms to concert halls, from courtrooms to the front lines of social change, for remarkable lives each shaped by duty, courage, and an unshakable belief in a better nation have come to their final rest. They were teachers, peacemakers, artists, and defenders of justice. They led movements, lifted voices, and held firm to values that defined generations. Their stories touched millions, even if many never knew their names. Tonight, we pause to honor them not simply for how they lived, but for what they left behind. These are the American legends who departed today, leaving a legacy that time itself will carry forward. A quiet sadness settled over the world of education today, as news confirmed the passing of a man who spent his life trying to lift children higher. The story of Roderick Raynor Paige begins long before he entered the national spotlight. It begins in rural Mississippi, in a world shaped by segregation and limited opportunity. He grew up knowing how hard it was for a child to dream. Yet he carried those early memories with a kind of quiet determination, believing that schools could offer something better than what he had known. Friends later recalled how he often said that every child deserves a fair start. Those words stayed with him throughout his entire life. He began as a teacher and coach, guiding young people with patience and a sense of duty. His classrooms were honest places, simple rooms filled with chalk, wooden desks, and the hope that learning could change a student's path. Many of his former students, now grown, still speak of the calm strength he brought into their lives. One wrote, "He believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." That was the heart of Roderick Paige. Long before leadership titles came, his rise through the educational system was slow, steady, and built on earned trust. After years as a teacher, he became a school administrator, then a superintendent. In Houston, he took on one of the most challenging school districts in the country. It was a place where students struggled, resources stretched thin, and expectations were uncertain. But he carried the same belief he had since childhood, that schools must give every child a fair chance. The Houstoners shaped him deeply. He pushed for higher standards, stronger accountability, and a new way of thinking about public education. His work drew national attention. Leaders across the country saw something rare, a man who could stand between policy and the classroom and understand both. A colleague once said, "He never forgot where he came from." That's what made his decisions feel real, not political. In 2001, Roderick Paige was sworn in as the 7th United States Secretary of Education. It was a historic moment. He became the first African American to hold the position, carrying with him the long history of those who were once excluded from the halls of national power. Yet he approached the role with humility. He often spoke softly, never rushing his words, always grounding decisions in what he believed children needed. During his tenure, the country witnessed the creation and passage of the No Child Left Behind Act. It became one of the most significant education reforms in modern American history. The act demanded measurable progress, stronger accountability, and attention to the students who were often overlooked. It sparked debate across the country, dividing opinions, but undeniably changing the landscape of public education. Paige stood in the center of it, committed to the idea that progress required courage. To him, the act was simple at its core: no child, no matter their zip code or background, should be forgotten in the system. He often repeated one phrase during interviews: "We must expect more from our schools, because our children deserve more." Those who worked closely with him say he carried the weight of that responsibility every day. As years passed, he stepped away from public office, but never from education. He continued speaking, teaching, and guiding institutions that saw his wisdom. He believes that reform was not a single moment but a lifelong process. He wrote books, served on boards, and mentored new leaders who would shape future policies. Even in retirement, he followed the progress of schools with the same close attention he had given as a young teacher. His passing on December 9, 2025, at the age of 92, closed a long chapter in American education. Tributes began to appear across the country from former presidents, educators, journalists, and families whose lives had been changed by his work. One message from a school superintendent read, "His voice never needed to be loud. His impact was loud enough." And that sentiment was echoed by many who recognized how deeply he influenced modern schooling. In the mid-body of his story, the reflections become more personal. Former students remembered the steady presence he brought to classrooms. Colleagues remembered the careful way he listened before offering guidance. Parents remembered how he fought for resources that helped their children succeed. And leaders remembered his clarity of purpose at a time when the nation's education system faced great pressure. He was a man guided by just simple beliefs that learning could change a life, and that fairness must be woven into every part of education. These beliefs shaped his legacy. His work with No Child Left Behind continues to influence policy debates today. Schools still measure progress through systems built on his earlier reforms, and millions of children who pass through public classrooms over 2 decades grew up under standards shaped, in part, by his vision. As the documentary flow moves toward reflection, the story shifts gently to what he meant beyond policy. Those who knew him describe a man with a calm voice, a humble manner, and a strong sense of service. His leadership never came from pride, it came from lived experience. He understood the barriers students face because he had once faced them himself. That empathy was a source of his strength. There was a certain quiet beauty in how he approached his final years. He spent time with family, offered advice when asked, and watched from a distance as new generations carried forward the work he had once led. Though his public appearances became fewer, his influence remained steady. Many educators referred to him not as a former secretary, but simply as a mentor. In the days after his passing, one tribute stood out. A former student, now a teacher, wrote, "He taught me how to dream, and now I teach my students the same way." It was a kind of legacy he would have cherished, not one measured in titles or policies, but in the passing of hope from one generation to the next. The chapter closes with the understanding that Roderick Paige was more than a leader. He was a reminder of what education can be when guided by compassion and courage. His life tells a story of a boy from Mississippi who grew into a national figure, yet never lost the heart of a teacher. And as the nation reflects on his journey, his legacy remains a steady flame in the long path toward equal opportunity. He will be remembered not only for the reforms he championed, but for the lives he touched quietly, steadily, and with unwavering belief in the power of learning. Tonight, his story rests in the hands of history, but his influence continues in every classroom that strives to give children a better tomorrow. And as his chapter closes, the documentary moves forward to another American life, one shaped not in policy or government, but in the powerful voice of a man who carried emotion through song. A gentle silence settled over New York this morning, as the news confirmed the passing of a woman whose voice had carried across 5 decades of struggle and hope. Cora Weiss spent most of her life standing where few dared to stand. She stepped into conflict with compassion, into protest with purpose, and into history with a quiet but unshakable courage. Her journey began in the early years of American social change, when young voices filled the streets and the nation searched for its conscience. She was just one person then, soft-spoken, determined, and unafraid of difficult truths. Her early activism grew from a simple belief: peace was not an idea, but a responsibility. Friends recalled how she often said, "If we don't speak for each other, no one will." That conviction guided her through decades of work that crossed borders, movements, and generations. She understood that real change required not only loud demonstrations, but patient conversations and long, exhausting hours behind the scenes. In the 1960s, her name rose during the height of the Vietnam War protests. Millions demanded answers, and Cora helped shape the marches that defined an era. She worked tirelessly to bring attention to civilian suffering, human rights violations, and the need for diplomacy over destruction. Even as tensions rose, she carried a calm voice that anchored her message. A fellow organizer once described her as the heartbeat of a movement that refused to give up. Her influence did not stop when the war ended. She stood firmly for racial equality, working alongside civil rights leaders who recognized her as an ally with both strength and empathy. She believed justice was never complete, it needed constant tending, constant vigilance. Her efforts helped connect peace activism with struggles for equality, forming a bridge many activists still walk today. As the decades moved forward, her work shifted to the international stage. Nuclear disarmament became one of her lifelong missions. She traveled the world meeting with diplomats, activists, and communities affected by weapons they never chose. Her message remained simple: the world must value human life over political power. The United Nations often welcomed her guidance, and she played a key role in shaping conversations that influenced global peace strategies. In the mid-body of her story, the tributes become softer and more personal. Friends remembered her as warm and steady. Younger activists described her as someone who opened doors without asking for credit. And on social media, a message from a former colleague read, "Cora didn't just fight for peace, she lived it every day." These reflections give warmth to a life that was often spent in the middle of difficult battles. Her later years were no quieter. Even in her 80s, she continued writing, speaking, and mentoring. She supported women's leadership in peace negotiations, believing that solutions came from voices often pushed aside. Her awards, honors, and recognitions filled rooms, yet she rarely spoke about them. She cared more about the work than the spotlight. Those who visited her said she remained sharp, curious, and hopeful, even as the world continued to struggle with the same issues she had fought for decades. Cora passed away in Manhattan at the age of 91, surrounded by the city where so much of her work began. The news spread quickly through activist circles, nonprofits, and international organizations. Condolences came from figures around the world. One tribute from a global peace ambassador stated, "Her voice changed conversations, her courage changed nations." Other messages poured in from ordinary people who had marched with her, learned from her, or been inspired by her unwavering dedication. Her story, told in these quiet moments, continues to echo because she represented something rare, a life devoted not to personal success, but to humanity itself. She spoke for peace when it was unpopular, stood for justice when it was dangerous, and lifted women's voices when they were ignored. Each action became part of a larger legacy that shaped movements still alive today. As the documentary flow moves into reflection, the narrative settles on the heart of her impact. Cora Weiss proved that one person could influence the direction of nations. Her activism helped end wars, guide international policy, and inspire countless young people to step into the work she once carried alone. Her legacy lives in classrooms, peace agreements, community centers, and in the hands of every new activist who believes that justice must be pursued with both strength and compassion. She leaves behind a world still in conflict, but also a world better for her presence. And though she has left this life, the causes she championed continue to move forward, shaped by her vision, steady hands, and tireless voice. Her memory now rests in the quiet promise she carried for so long, that peace is always possible. Even in the darkest years, she will be remembered as a builder of hope, a defender of humanity, and a woman who turned protest into peace. And as her story closes, the documentary gently turns to another American legend, one whose gift was not in activism, but in the power of a single voice that touched hearts around the world. A gentle hush moved through the world of music today, as news confirmed the passing of a man whose voice felt like a doorway into the soul. Jubilant Sykes lived a life shaped by sound, faith, and an emotional honesty that reached listeners far beyond the stage. His voice was more than an instrument, it was a story, soft, powerful, and deeply human. For decades, he brought classical technique into conversation with gospel warmth, blending worlds that rarely touched and creating something unforgettable. He began his journey in Los Angeles, raised in a home where music flowed through ordinary days. Family members remembered him as a child who hummed before he spoke, always echoing melodies he heard on the radio or in church. A friend once said, "He didn't learn to sing, he grew into it." That gentle truth shaped the early years of a young man who dreamed big but carried himself with calm humility. His talents soon guided him toward professional training. He studied classical voice, learned technique, and pushed himself to understand every detail of breath and tone. But he carried something that technique alone could not teach, a deep emotional clarity that listeners felt instantly. Audiences described his voice as warm, like a quiet light rising inside a dark room. Sykes moved from local performances to national stages, orchestra halls, opera venues, and intimate churches all welcomed him. No matter the setting, he sang with the same sincerity. Critics praised his ability to cross genres without losing authenticity. One reviewer wrote, "He sings as if every note carries a memory," and for many who heard him, that description felt true. In the mid-body years of his career, he performed with some of the world's greatest symphonies. Conductors admired his sensitivity, musicians respected his discipline, audiences simply listened, sometimes in silence, sometimes in tears. His interpretations of spirituals became signature moments. They carried the weight of history and the tenderness of prayer. Despite his success, he never chased fame. He preferred connection over applause. Students he mentored recalled how gently he guided them, offering advice with kindness rather than pressure. A young singer once wrote online, "He made me believe my voice mattered." That message echoed across tributes after his passing. Jubilant Sykes was more than an artist. He was a storyteller who used sound instead of words. His performances often felt like conversations between heart and sky. When he sang, something settled in the room, a calmness, a softness, a reminder that music can heal what life injures. His passing on December 8, 2025, came as a quiet shock to those who admired him. Friends described a man who still carried enthusiasm for new projects, new collaborations, and fresh interpretations. His loss leaves a gap not only in performance halls, but in the emotional landscape of those who found comfort in his sound. Tributes began appearing quickly across the music community. A conductor who worked closely with him shared, "He never forced a moment, he let the music breathe, and in that breath you felt his soul." A longtime friend offered another memory, "He sang with courage, not volume, that was his gift." These reflections painted the portrait of a man whose artistry was rooted in humility, As the documentary moves gently through his story, the scene shifts to quieter details of his life. Sykes valued peace, family, and faith. He spent time teaching, believing that every voice held potential. His students remember how he listened before he corrected, how he encouraged before he critiqued. Many credit him for giving them the confidence to pursue careers they once feared were out of reach. Even outside the classroom, he carried a calm presence. He volunteered within his community, participated in charity concerts, and used his talent to support causes close to his heart. His voice became a gift not only to audiences, but to those who needed hope. He often said that singing was a form of prayer. Those who knew him believe he meant it fully. His recordings continue to circulate, each track a reminder of the depth he brought to his craft. Songs he performed decades ago still sound fresh, still hold emotional weight, still speak to listeners who discover them for the first time. That lasting resonance is part of what made him extraordinary. Near the closing of his chapter, the story returns to the essence of who he was. Jubilant Sykes walked through the world with gentleness. He turned difficult songs into soft reflections. He held pain inside a single sustained note. He made music feel human, not distant or unreachable. He gave audiences a way to feel understood without saying a word. As his final tribute echoes across the documentary, the reflection becomes clear. His legacy is not measured only in concerts or accolades. It lives in the people he inspired, the students he guided, and the listeners he comforted. His career was long, meaningful, and filled with grace. He leaves behind a world that feels slightly quieter without him, yet grateful for the light he shared. Tonight his voice rests, but its memory continues, gentle, steady, and filled with the warmth that defined him. And as this chapter closes, the documentary moves toward another American life, one not shaped by music, but by a steadfast commitment to justice and truth. Tragic news has been confirmed tonight, marking the end of a long and honorable journey. Robert B. Fisk Jr., one of America's most trusted and admired trial attorneys, passed away on December 4, 2025. His departure closes a chapter in American law that stretched across decades, shaped by discipline, fairness, and an unusual calm in the face of the nation's most difficult legal storms. For many, Fisk was more than a lawyer. He was a steady hand in moments when the country struggled to understand the truth. His presence was quiet, but his influence reached courtrooms, classrooms, and the hearts of younger attorneys who studied his every move. Those who knew him often said that he never raised his voice to win a point. He let the facts do that for him. News of his passing spread slowly through the legal community, shared first in hushed tones and then in heartfelt tributes. A former colleague wrote, "He held himself to a standard that made everyone around him better." Another added, "When Fisk walked into a room, people listened not because he demanded it, but because he earned it." His life began far away from the spotlight of major federal cases. Born in New York in 1930, he grew up in a world where discipline was expected and responsibility was taught early. He carried those lessons with him to Princeton, then learned the deeper seriousness of his calling at the University of Michigan Law School. People who studied alongside him said he was the type of student who always pushed himself harder than anyone else ever would when he entered public service. He did it with a clear mission. Justice should never be about winning, it should always be about truth. That belief carried him through scandals, political pressure, and cases that tested the limits of public trust. But no matter how tense the moment became, he never forgot who he was, or the oath he took. During the 1970s as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, he handled cases that demanded absolute precision: organized crime, political corruption, and financial fraud. The work was heavy, but he never treated it as a burden. A former assistant once said, "He showed up every day with the same steady look, the same calm voice, the same belief that the law could make things better later." The nation would look to him in one of its most politically charged moments. When he was appointed independent counsel in 1994, the country was divided and tense. But Fisk approached the investigation the way he approached everything: carefully, quietly, and with a commitment to facts over noise. Even his critics admitted that he brought a rare balance to an impossible assignment. Though his time as independent counsel ended sooner than expected, his reputation never wavered. In fact, his calm professionalism only strengthened the respect he received. For younger legal minds, he became a model of how to protect the truth without letting politics or pressure bend the law. Over the next decades, he continued his work in private practice, guiding major corporations through complex investigations and crises. But he never used his power to intimidate. His approach was always the same: understand the facts, respect the people involved, and never forget that the law is a tool, not a weapon. Friends often said he lived two lives at once. In the courtroom, he was sharp, prepared, and unshakable. At home, he was gentle, warm, and proud of the family that stayed by his side through every chapter of his long career. One family member shared, "He taught us that integrity isn't a big moment, it's the small choices you make every single day." Even in his later years, after many of his peers had retired, Fisk still carried the same curiosity he had as a young lawyer. He read constantly. He mentored young attorneys who sought his guidance. He believed that no generation owned justice and had to be passed on, carefully, like a torch. Those who worked with him remember the small habits that defined him: the organized desk, the handwritten notes, the quiet pauses before making a decision. He believed that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes threatened fairness. That steady discipline shaped every ruling, every statement, and every piece of advice he gave. As news of his passing reached law firms, universities, and former federal offices, more tributes poured in. A law professor wrote, "He showed us that the law can be both strong and human." A retired judge shared, "I never saw him lose control. Not once." His respect for the court was complete. What made him truly remarkable was the honesty of his life. There was no hidden agenda, no secret ambition. He wanted the truth, and he wanted it presented clearly, with dignity. That simple belief guided him through cases that shaped national conversations and redefined public expectations. For legal ethics. In his work, he had seen the best and worst of human behavior. He understood how power could be misused, how ambition could cloud judgment, and how justice could be threatened by anger or confusion. But he also believed deeply in the possibility of fairness, even in complicated times. When younger attorneys asked him how to handle hard cases, he offered a quiet reply: "Start with the facts, everything else comes later." It was advice that carried the weight of decades and the depth of someone who lived by those words. His legacy is not only in the cases he won or the investigations he led. It is in the example he left behind, the honesty in his voice, the discipline in his work, the balance he brought to legal storms that could have divided the country even further. Tonight, as the world looks back on his long and steady path, there is a quiet sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the guardrails he helped build. Gratitude for the generations he taught. Gratitude for the dignity he brought into rooms that often lacked it. He didn't seek fame. He didn't chase the spotlight. He chased clarity, fairness, and truth, values that feel especially important today. His passing marks the end of a career that shaped legal standards for more than half a century. But his influence does not disappear. It stays in the lawyers he trained, the institutions he strengthened, and the quiet reminder that justice depends on those who defend it with humility, not pride. In the final tributes shared by those closest to him, one line stood out: "He believed in the lion, the law believed in him." Robert B. Fisk Jr. leaves behind a legacy built not on noise, but on integrity, a legacy rooted in the idea that justice, when protected with patience and honesty, can change a nation. And as this chapter of his life closes, his story remains a reminder that true guardians of justice never seek attention. They earn respect by how they live, how they serve, and how they stand firm when the world needs them most. Tonight, he is remembered with gratitude, respect, and a quiet farewell, honoring a man who carried the weight of justice with a steady hand and a faithful heart.